Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and Apple finally did it. They finally refreshed the MacBook Air. After years of waiting for a MacBook Air with a Retina screen, Apple finally gave us what we wanted. But is it exactly what we wanted? And it's also a confusing time to be purchasing a MacBook. There are so many different options out there. You have the $1299 regular MacBook, you have the $1299 MacBook Pro, which is actually more powerful than this new MacBook Air, and you still have the $1,000 old MacBook Air without the Retina screen with the big giant silver bezels still sitting there at $1,000. It's never been a more confusing time to buy a MacBook, especially if you're a regular consumer out there. If you're watching this, you might be going, which MacBook should I buy, or should I even buy a MacBook? I want to kind of cover that in this video. I recently did a video covering the iPad Pro, some things you should look into if you're interested in it, or maybe some other considerations, and that video has been pretty popular. I've gotten a lot of good response out of that video, so I wanted to do the same for people who are currently shopping for a MacBook. So Apple brought back what we liked a lot in that first MacBook Air. It is a slim computer with a smaller footprint overall than the original MacBook Air. Now this MacBook Air, like the old MacBook Air, has a taper as it goes along, so the thinness on this MacBook Air is actually 0.41 centimeters to 15.6 centimeters. It weighs 2.75 pounds, which is a little bit of a middle ground between the current MacBook, which weighs about 2 pounds, and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which weighs around 3 pounds. It also has the reduced bezel size like the current generation of MacBook Pros, where they got rid of those giant silver bezels on the old MacBook Air, replaced them with a sleek, glossy black bezel that doesn't really take up as much space, but it's still a little bit wider than some computers. That's because Apple still fits the FaceTime camera on the top of the display, which is actually in 720p HD as opposed to the current MacBook, which only has a 480p webcam. You also get the new generation of Butterfly keyboard, which is a mixed bag. I currently like that generation of keyboard. I think it feels really good, especially the third generation. They improved some of the reliability where they made the keys feel a little bit softer. That is currently one of my favorite keyboards to use, but I know a lot of people have had issues with them. They don't like the low travel of them, and the first and second generation version of that keyboard have been known to be unreliable. I've seen some reports of the third generation keyboards broken, but nowhere near as much as the first generation. You also get the Touch ID fingerprint sensor in the top right of the keyboard. This is the first MacBook to have Touch ID without actually using the touch bar. So if you hate the touch bar, but you do like unlocking your computer with your fingerprint, that is also another added benefit to this new MacBook Air. Now, unlike the old MacBook Air, it is dropping all of those legacy ports, so you will not have MagSafe anymore, you will not have USB-A ports anymore, or you will not have an SD card reader. Apple is replacing that with 2 Thunderbolt 3 USB-C ports, and that is for charging and connection. It's a very versatile port. I've given my opinion many times on the Thunderbolt 3 port. I definitely like it, and I do like how powerful it is. It's powerful enough to drive a 5K monitor or 2 4K monitors, but if you do have legacy ports, if you're going to be using USB-A ports, if you need an SD card reader like I do as a video editor, you are going to have to buy an adapter for your new MacBook Air. Unlike the new iPad Pros, Apple is keeping the headphone jack on the new Retina MacBook Air, so if you have headphones with wires, you can use them on the MacBook Air. And this MacBook Air actually comes in 3 finishes for the first time. It's going to come in silver, space gray, and a new gold color, which looks really, really nice. So let's talk a little bit more about this Retina screen and how it differs from some of the current screens offered in the MacBook. It's not the same exact screen that's in the MacBook Pro. So it is a Retina screen. It has a resolution of 2560 by 1600, the same resolution currently found in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, but it's not as advanced as the display found in the 13-inch MacBook Pro. It doesn't have support for the P3 wide color gamut, although it's still a huge improvement coming from the previous generation's Air screen, where it didn't have a Retina screen, and it also didn't have an IPS panel screen, which meant that if you went a little off axis on your viewing angles, you would get a lot of color distortion, a lot of reduced brightness. So at least Apple is bringing in an IPS Retina LCD screen into this, but you are losing the P3 wide color support if that is important to you. Now, another controversy with this new MacBook Air is that it's using a lower powered version of the Intel processors. It'll be using a lower wattage CPU, which has some disadvantages, but also some advantages. Disadvantages obviously being it'll be a little bit slower than the current current MacBook Pro processors, but also an advantage that you'll be gaining some battery life. Apple is quoting the battery to be around 12 hours of use with Wi-Fi and up to 13 hours of video playback. It's a 1.6 gigahertz dual-core i5 processor with turbo boost up to 3.6 gigahertz. If we take a look at some of the early Geekbench scores, we can see that it has a 4,248 single-core score and a 7,828 multi-core score. Now, this is definitely an improvement, although a small improvement over the previous generation MacBook Air, and also an improvement over the 12-inch MacBook. However, it is a complete slouch compared to the new iPad Pro, where the multi-core score is easily double that of the new Retina MacBook Air. The new iPad Pro can get an 18,000 multi-core score, while this MacBook Air is struggling to even break 8,000. And you can't upgrade the processor in this 13-inch Retina MacBook Air. This is the only processor available to purchase. Even if you want to put an upgrade in it, you can't. And that entry level is going to start you at $1,199. Although you can't upgrade the processor, you can upgrade the storage and the RAM. So adding 256 gigabytes of storage is going to increase the price to $1,400, and you can configure that up to 1.5 terabytes, and that fully maxed out is going to be $2,599. Now, the base configuration of this MacBook Air with only 128 gigabytes is pretty low. I really recommend, if you're considering purchasing this, maybe spring for the extra 256 gigabytes. I know it's increasing the price by $200, and if you're in the market for a MacBook Air, you might be looking for a budget laptop. If you can make the 128 gigabytes work for you, if you're really just using it for web browsing, watching videos, storing some light files, maybe you have an iCloud subscription where you can store files in the cloud, maybe that 128 gigabyte model will work for you, but I really recommend springing for the 256 gigabyte model, as you won't be able to upgrade the storage later on. Although the interesting thing is, once you upgrade that base storage model to 256, you could actually purchase the MacBook, the regular 12-inch MacBook, for $12.99 and get a 256 gigabyte storage and 8 gigabytes of RAM. Although the processor will be slower, you're also getting a lighter computer. On top of that, if you want the 128 gigabyte storage, you could also opt to get the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which has a faster processor inside of it, has 8 gigabytes of RAM, but you're also losing some other features like Touch ID, like the new improved keyboard, but you're also getting a slightly better display with the P3 wide color gamut, which really begs the question for me is, who should buy this Retina MacBook Air? Who should be purchasing this over the 12-inch MacBook, and who should be purchasing this over the $12.99 MacBook Pro? And I really think that's for someone in the middle of both of those computers. Obviously, the MacBook is for someone who has a super light workflow, who's only really using it for web browsing, who wants the lightest possible device to carry around with them, who doesn't want a loud fan operating while the processor is heating up, who doesn't need to do video editing or anything like that. And the 13-inch MacBook Pro is obviously for someone who has a heavier workflow. If you're doing video editing, photo editing, any task you label with the Pro badge, you're going to want to start looking into something a little bit more capable, like that $12.99 MacBook Pro. But yeah, that customer in between, this is really designed for someone who wants something light, but also capable. So this is for someone who is going to be doing a lot of web browsing. They have to do a lot of email. If you're a writer, obviously you don't need too much power. You just need something small, thin, and light to carry around with you. If you're going to school, you have to type out a bunch of essays. You need to bring this thing to class with you. You need a really, really good battery life. The 13-inch Retina MacBook Air looks to be like a good choice. Even things like plugging it into a projector for a keynote presentation, and even doing some light workflows. Maybe you're doing some light photo editing, some light Photoshop, or even if you're using one of Apple's optimized apps like Final Cut Pro 10, you could run that on a MacBook Air. You want something that has good battery life, something that's light, but can also handle a little bit more tasks than the current MacBook. Maybe you're asking, what other advantages does this MacBook Air have that the $12.99 MacBook doesn't have and the $12.99 MacBook Pro doesn't have? And that is simple. It has the new T2 security chip. It does have some added benefits, which I would also take into account when deciding which computer you're going to purchase. That T2 security chip is going to secure that MacBook Air even better. So if you are really into privacy, you want something secure. For example, when you close the new Retina MacBook Air's lid, it'll actually disable the microphones to prevent people from snooping or spying in on you or hacking into your microphones and listening into your conversation. It also will encrypt your computer through the T2 chip, and it'll support secure booting through the T2 chip as well. The T2 chip also gives you better performance through the SSD speeds. Apple does all the SSD controller speeds through that T2 chip, which is how Apple is able to get those industry-leading solid-state drive speeds, and you'll have that on the new Retina MacBook Air, and that's something you won't get on the $1,299 MacBook or the $1,299 MacBook Pro. And of course, the biggest benefit to having that T2 chip is the addition of Touch ID on the top right corner of the Retina MacBook Air. Not only is this a super fast way to authenticate and log into your MacBook, but it's also really helpful when you're logging into multiple apps on websites. If you're using a application password manager like 1Password, really excels at quickly logging you in, not only just into your MacBook, but when you're entering your password in for various websites as well. So let me offer you some alternatives. Who is this not for? If you are a pro, and you know you're a pro, you know you need to do video editing, you know you need to do photo editing, you know you need to do music production, this is not something I think you should really be looking into. I honestly wouldn't look into that $1,299 MacBook Pro either, although it is capable, and maybe if you do have a lighter workflow, you can make it work for you. I really would recommend those new MacBook Pros that Apple released a couple months ago, 13-inch starting at $799 that has a quad-core processor, and if you're doing a bunch of processor-intensive applications, that is going to be a really big benefit for you. I would really stick away from that MacBook Air if you think you're going to be doing any sort of heavy workflow. Now that MacBook at the $1,299 level, I also wouldn't recommend that because it doesn't have that T2 security chip, and I do think you're getting a lot of added benefits for it. Even if you have to bump the storage up to 256 gigabytes, you're still getting the improved keyboard, you're still getting the T2 security chip, and you are getting a faster machine overall. But if you do want the thinnest, quietest, lightest Mac available and processor speed really isn't important to you, that 12-inch MacBook still does serve an important part in the Apple lineup. Which begs the question, does that $1,299 MacBook Pro really have a seat at the table? And I kind of think it doesn't. I think out of all the laptops in Apple's lineup, it's the one that doesn't deserve to be here. Sure, it's going to be slightly faster than this new MacBook Air, but it's also losing that T2 security chip, which is going to lose out on SSD performance. Also don't get the fingerprint sensor or the improved 3rd generation Butterfly keyboard. Maybe if you are a pro on a really big budget and the $1,299 Pro is the only version you can afford, that's really who I can only recommend it for. You will be getting a slightly faster workload, but I really see Apple getting rid of that 13-inch MacBook Pro in the near future. I don't think it's going to be around much longer. You could even go with the alternative of getting that new iPad Pro that Apple just announced. If you don't need to run traditional Mac OS, if you're okay with running an iOS version of software, if you are a digital artist who wants to use the Apple Pencil and you plan to use drawing applications, even if you're a photo editor, there are some really amazing apps like Affinity Photo already available on the iPad, and Photoshop is going to be on the iPad in 2019. I know what a lot of you are thinking. What about the old MacBook Air that Apple kept at $1,000? Should you purchase that? No, do not purchase that MacBook Air. I really can't recommend it. The processor's older in it. The screen is just horrible by today's standards. Really, if you're going to get any sort of modern MacBook, just spend an extra $200 for the Retina MacBook Air, or again, consider that iPad Pro that's priced at $800. So I will be picking up that new Retina MacBook Air, and I'm going to be getting a lot more opinions on it once I can actually use it, but I know a lot of people are rushing out trying to buy the new iPad Pro, the new MacBook Air. Maybe if you're like me, you want that new Mac Mini, and I really just wanted to give some solid buying advice, at least from my perspective as I see it today, on what you should purchase if you're in the market for one of these products. If you are interested in that full review, I will be having one later this month, so make sure you stick around to the channel. If you like this video, make sure you give it a like. If you want to see more from my channel, make sure you're subscribed. And let me know what you think of that Retina MacBook Air in the comments below. I'm really interested to see if you guys are interested in that MacBook Air, if you're going to be going for the higher end MacBook Pro, if you're going to be going for that 12-inch MacBook, or if you're going to take my advice, maybe you're going to go for an iPad Pro this time instead of a MacBook Air. Anyway, let me know in the comments below, guys, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.